Learning to become, learning to learn, learning to thrive, learning to flourish, learning to care.
It is now time to listen to our voices.
To prepare a better future.
Treat others and
the planet as you would wish to be treated.
Collaborating
and develop in partnership. We have the capacity
to understand,
to take action,
to take care of ourselves, others, and the planet.
And we want to invite you
to really work together
and collaborate so that we can have an impact now.
Welcome to Learning Planet Festival.
It can just get better.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our session on financing complexity, enabling systemic change in education. This session is the first in a series on the theme of financing education systems that are being organised by Learning Planet. We are really delighted to have you. Thank you very much for coming. We are bringing together a group of senior leaders from organisations financing education development projects around the world. And we're giving them a space to talk to each other and experts about the topic, as well as members of the Learning Planet network who would like to learn more. So we have participants with a wide range of knowledge on the subject. Some are actively implementing systems change funding approaches in different forms, and some are completely new to the idea. We've got everything in between. And we have brought people together as changemakers who are implementing initiatives for systemic change and people who are funding systemic change. And we're continuing the conversation that was outlined in Ashoka's most recent report, Embracing Complexity, which focuses on the breadth of the responses and the ways in which funders and systemic change makers can work together in new ways to finance the complexity of education system improvement. So we're really pleased that you've joined us today. We have somebody who will be doing live text translation in French. So if you are on the Attendify platform, you will see the French text translation come up on the right-hand side of your screen. So to give you a bit of context for this session, as outlined in Ashoka's report, Embracing Complexity, whose author is with us today, there are significant financial resources dedicated to solving humanity's most pressing problems. And we really need a collaborative effort by funders, intermediaries, and systems change leaders to address those problems. And these challenges require systemic answers, but currently the dominant funding practices are fairly ill-suited to support
Florian, I wonder if, in absence of Leonora, you perhaps would like to pick up with your thoughts.
Sure, let me do that. Thank you, Ross. I have the pleasure to kick us off with an input from Ashoka. My name is Florian Rutsch, and I co-lead the Europe Fellowship Program at Ashoka, where I helped co-author this report that Leonora was just mentioning. It was a collaborative effort of a number of players in the global ecosystem.
Unbelievable.
Catalyst 2030 is part of as well, who we hear from.
I wasn't, because Florence just started talking.
So I'll just briefly share our perspective on why we got involved in this work and why we believe funding system change is important. I'm going to show a couple of slides that help clarify our perspective. So I think what's clear and why we're all here in the session is that we need better education systems, right? The educational challenges that we want to solve in the world, they're products of broken systems. So we need to ultimately, with any innovation solution that we develop, to address the broken systems behind those problems. And as Ashoka, right, we work with systemic social entrepreneurs around the world, 4,000 of them in about 90 countries. And we've learned from them how they change systems. Their type of leadership, their empathetic, servant, persistent leadership and systemic way of working can help address those systemic challenges. I mean, I actually started out Ashoka 5 years ago, working very closely with our Ashoka fellows through our fellowship program. And one of the things that became very clear to me is the last 2 points here, and that's that systemic work is very different from what we typically would describe as maybe project or program-based work. Right? Systemic work means to maybe advocate for policy change, to share knowledge, to influence key stakeholders. And all of that requires a different mindset, a different approach, different measures of success, and importantly, adaptive strategies. So that kind of work is difficult to impossible to do if it is packaged up in a sort of restricted project with a clear start to end, with very restrictive measures of success and indicators based often on measures like how many beneficiaries have been reached. All of those are constraining what's possible when we think about systemic work. But unfortunately, most funding is geared towards that kind of project or program-based work. So following the journey of our Ashoka fellows, I've learned that basically the work that they describe as being most impactful, their systemic work, is receiving the least funding. And that's kind of what propelled me to go into this. I see the kind of a systemic issue here in our sector where we see the most potential for impact is also where there's the least funding. So that's what brought us into, certainly brought me into this field of work. And just 2 quick stats to illustrate a bit the challenge here. So to do this kind of systemic work, one of the most important types of funding is unrestricted long-term funding. But when we conducted the research for our report, we found that almost 3/4 of the system change leaders that we have interviewed, so people who are quite advanced already and who've somehow managed to fund their work, have less than 1/4 of their funds available to them unrestricted. All of their other funding is restricted in some way, and therefore restricting their ability in many cases to achieve system change. And one more that's a challenge from our experience is that often these restricted ways of funding actually change the direction, the scope, require the social entrepreneur, the social change leader, the system change leader to adjust their path just to fit with funder criteria. Even though they tend to be the ones at the forefront of system change who are deeply embedded in the systems. So this is also an appeal to funders to put more trust into system change leaders, who are dedicating their life to changing these issues, and build on their experience in the way that they fund. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Florian, and thank you very much for stepping in when I was kicked out of my own session. So I wanted to ask people's background and what finance and complexity means to them. So I think you've explained from your perspective. Ross, over to you. I know that the Jacobs Foundation and Ashoka have worked together. Perhaps you could give us a little overview of that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Leonora, and thanks for that introduction, Florian. I mean, we know that this is complex work. So our focus at the Jacobs Foundation is in transforming education systems, which we know is complex, that we know requires collective action. We're conscious of the challenges, the demands and the challenges of providing unrestricted funding. We're conscious of the challenges in that of the perhaps underuse of evidence to support funding of unrestricted projects. So we're very happy to be working with Ashoka and a lot of other partners in different parts of the world to try to bring fresh thinking to the world of philanthropy, which has up until now mostly, I think, struggled with the provision of unrestricted funding for collective impact projects that transform systems.
Thank you, Ross. I know we have an expert with us on the subject, Alicia Taylor. We'll talk a little bit about some of the work you've done with the Central European University later, but could you give us an idea of what finance and complexity means to you?
Sure. Well, thank you for the invitation to join this conversation. And so I'm Alicia. I'm the interim Chief Technical Officer for Insights for Education, which we'll talk about in a moment. But in terms of thinking about what financing complexity means to me. I think it begins with, it has to begin with an appreciation that solutions, particularly in the education sector, are complex, are interrelated, and also context specific. And it requires us as education specialists to resist the pull of silver bullets or magic bullets that can be uniformly implemented across contexts. I think it also requires an appreciation for the needs and challenges of the range of stakeholders and communities that are engaged from the design to implementation of interventions. I think also when we speak about financing, it implies that decisions may be made quite far or distant from the end user or the beneficiary, or in the education sector, thinking about teachers and students in classrooms. And so when we talk about financing complexity, we need to make sure that their needs and challenges also remain top of mind, and that the interventions that are funded sort of serve their needs. Insights for Education is a new foundation. We're just a little over a year old, and we seek to build bridges across the communities of policymakers, knowledge actors, and implementers in the education sector, with the goal of ensuring that the scarce resources in the sector are allocated to interventions that we know can work, or that we know that work, and not just know that they work, but we know how they work, in what context, and for whom, and that this information is in the hands of decision makers and implementers.
Thank you, Alicia. And Francois, I wanted to ask you this question because we invited you to give a different perspective, that of a change maker. So from Learning Planet, from CRE, from you, what does financing complexity mean?
First, I have to say that I was very impressed by the report that Florian has presented, because, and in fact, it's not the first time I'm impressed by what Ashoka does, I have to say, because, you know, when they told me I was a social entrepreneur, I had to look up for what the word meant. And then when they talk about, you know, funding complexity, again, I had to do it. And at some point, you know, Bill Carter came to me and told me about social scientific entrepreneur. And again, I had to try to look at, you know, what that could mean. But in fact, these 3 times, I could see myself in what has been described. And that's quite interesting, because I'm supposed to be somewhat reflexive, but, you know, it's very hard to take some distance from what you do. And so especially on that report on funding complexity and system change, I have to say that, you know, I think what is written in this report is more or less the way we've experienced our collaborations with the Betancourt Foundation. And the Betancourt Foundation has been helping us since 2006. Okay, so it's 15 years of joint collaboration that we're celebrating this year. And I think they've very well understood the fact that we were trying to address problems that were more complex than what we could define from the start. So they sort of trusted our intuitions and our first realizations, but they didn't ask us to stick to what they were funding initially. They empowered us and enabled us to progressively expand to other horizons. And I think, you know, that was very visionary of them. And I think it's basically what they help us do is fund projects and the young ones carrying those projects. And, you know, their motto is to give wings to talents, and ours is to try to help talents fly. So, you know, we basically build an environment where this foundation and the CRE as an organization were co-evolving in what we did together. And they progressively decided to give us more money when they saw the fruitful collaboration that we had initiated. And they claim that they've learned, but we certainly have learned a lot from them. And I think that, you know, it's this joint learning is what Florian is talking about in this report. And indeed, I think it's quite exceptional to have such relationship. Indeed, many foundations are, you know, funding projects rather than, you know, an ecosystem. And if we do want to have the massive change that we need to have in order to face, the world challenges and to equip the new generations to face those challenges so that they can care for oneself, care for others, and care for the planet. I think we have to be able to work with founders that understand that long-term perspective and understand the need for system change. And so I really want to be very thankful for that foundation and for all the foundations that Florian and others have studied, because I think that they are pioneers. And we talk a lot about pioneers in science and pioneers in education and pioneers in technology, but I think pioneers in funding is probably not as celebrated, but I think it should, and we should be able to learn from them and to learn from their experience and the sort of joint journey that they've done with social entrepreneurs, that they've done with project carriers that were going beyond the initial project and progressively managed to have an ecosystem perspective and a systemic change that could be progressively seen and would be evolving with the needs of the world. Who was funded to prepare the youth for the COVID? No one. But if you were preparing the youth to be empowered and to face challenges, then maybe those youth were better able to face the COVID. And I think that's the sort of system change that we need to have, because the COVID is our first global crisis, but it's probably not our last global crisis. And that when they reach that scale and that speed, we have to empower the youth. And the youth is willing to have this, but it requires an ecosystem that can weave their initiatives and can help them to learn from one another and step on the shoulders of giants in order to see further.
Thank you very much, everybody, for the introductory remarks. I have a question that's a little bit to drill down a little bit into what your organizations are doing, and I'm particularly interested to speak to a funder and a changemaker. So Urvashi and Ross, I'll be asking you to give us a brief overview of the work that you or your organization or both are doing in this area, and how you feel you're making a difference in funding systems change. So Urvashi, I would love to ask you first.
Thank you, Leonora, and thank you, Learning Planet, for inviting me to speak on this panel. I'm Urvashi Sani, and I'm the founder and CEO of Study Hall Education Foundation, working in India, in Lucknow, Uttar Pradesh. I was just mentioning while we were chatting before the call began that I'm so glad that we're having this panel. Our organization, actually, we were founded because we wanted to effect systems change of two kinds. One is, I really believe that everybody talks about systems change, education systems change, or system change in education. One is just trying to change the large systems of education that governments have, right? Public schools, the public has. And another one is trying to change the perception of education itself, that it's too narrow, too wedded to literacy and numeracy, and especially in countries like ours, and to testing and scores, and then certificates, and then the labor force. And to broaden it and deepen it. Education is a very powerful individual and social transformative force, provided it's transformed. So for the last 35 years, we've been trying to effect that transformation, trying to transform the perception of education. And one of the ways in which we've conceived it, that it's a very important vehicle for social change. There are social systems, and I'll give you an example. We work very hard at teaching lessons of equality in embedding them in our official curriculum, along with math, science, history, etc. And we are striving for gender equality. So whereas, access is one thing and gender parity in schools is one thing. But more importantly, in India, for example, we have 90% enrollment and we have more girls enrolled than boys in primary right now. But look at the gender indicators. We have high rates of domestic violence, 4 rapes an hour, and 1/3 of the world's child brides. So we have not achieved gender equality even while we achieve gender parity. So we developed a critical feminist pedagogy, and we teach it. We help our girls and boys deconstruct patriarchy and help them construct egalitarian mindsets. Because half the problem is that we have very strong patriarchal mindsets and social, which lead to social norms, which unless those change, we are not going to achieve gender equality. And you can do that through education. So to go back to the funding, the problem of funding, this is a very complex issue. It's centuries old. It's not, and there are so many intersectionalities. There's caste, there's poverty, there's religion. There's so many things involved in that. They're trying to deconstruct that. It's almost, it's, when I'm thinking of it, I'm panting and huffing and puffing because it takes so much effort to work with and to work with it at so many different ways. And the results, because it's so complex, aren't you not going to see them overnight? It's a long haul that we have to work at. But it's really important because unless you achieve that, there is no point of achieving gender parity within education. So unless you change education so that it changes mindsets, you're not going to achieve the results that you want, and that's going to take time. So like you said, Florian, in your slides, I love them, by the way, that, and congratulations for that, that whereas you get money for programs, the moment you can show that, we're going to get so many girls into school, everyone is rah, let's give you, the number of beneficiaries you can reach, perfect. Let's give you the money. And there are the millions that come for that. When you tell them that we're trying to help boys and girls and communities change patriarchal mindsets so that we can have real gender equality, and we do it through education by getting girls to become self-advocates, boys to become advocates for girls, and teachers to become advocates for girls in the community, and parents to become allies. That takes a lot of convincing because this kind of work, it takes patience, it takes courage, it takes persistence, and it takes hope. But unless you do the hard work, I don't know where you're going to get. And so there are the funders we're very lucky. We found a couple of them and they stayed with us for a very long time because they understand. They act like partners. And they watch over you, but not like Big Brother. They watch over you because they understand you, they support you, understand how difficult it is. And they also understand that because you're the foot soldiers, you really know best. Right? So I think for complex systems, then you need complex ways of measuring outcomes. And you need funders to understand that and to understand that simple RCTs aren't really going to do this for you. Because RCTs are able to measure something that is really reduced to the simplest factor. So, I'm going to stop there and come back later.
Thank you very much, Ravati. So, I mean, from a changemaker perspective, it certainly sounds complex to fund the parts of programs that need to be funded in order to impact this change. Ross, from the perspective of a foundation, how are you addressing this?
Thanks, Leonora. And very interesting to hear your comments, Vishi's. A number of things really resonated. That idea of changing perceptions and not only changing systemic mechanisms, for example, and again, the reference to the complexity of this, the idea that we need to engage communities in the transformation of their own systems as opposed to taking colonial approaches are some of the things that we as the Jacobs Foundation have recognized and are trying to address. And by the way, I wouldn't for a moment claim that we have all the answers or have any silver bullets, but I think we're recognizing some really fundamental challenges and important strategies that hopefully will work to some extent and will at least inspire and inform other people to follow suit. So we are focused on transforming education systems, but to Vishi's point, I think we're recognizing that we can't consider it doesn't help to only think of education systems in a narrow sense. So yes, we are interested in transforming the experience and the environment of schools, for example, but we also are trying to reach beyond schools to the idea of weaving whole learning ecosystems. So Francois was referring to that earlier, this idea of weaving a whole learning ecosystem around a child so that that child is able to learn to thrive together. So our very North Star, I suppose, is the idea that we want to contribute to the creation of learning ecosystems in which every child is able to thrive together. The challenge we are posing here is that we believe that literacy and numeracy are absolutely essential, but they're not sufficient. We have to be developing more than that in young people if they want to thrive. We're challenging the idea that the very purpose, as Vichy is pointing out, often of education is narrowly individualistic and economic, and that we need to broaden that idea out to the idea of thriving, which is essentially equipping and inclining every child to what we might think of learn to thrive together, so to care for themselves and others and the planet together. And to do that, you need to empower the whole community in that work. So that's our very North Star. Then from a programmatic perspective, we are, on the one hand, funding programs which are trying to improve the generation and use of evidence in the process of transforming systems. So we do see challenges of issue around RCTs. We are very insistent on rigorous evidence and can see the benefits and the difficulties of RCTs. So we're open to new approaches for generating evidence. We're focused on the problem of spreading innovations between schools, where innovations are very common but are often stuck in schools. And we're focused on trying to model approaches to transformation. I think the emphasis here is on the approach to transformation as much as the end result, so that we're trying to invest in weaving approaches where whole communities can connect with each other, collaborate with each other, and learn together to transform their own systems. And our hope is that by taking these rather novel approaches to investment, that we will be able to model approaches and inspire and inform others to learn with us.
Thank you very much, Ross. Florian, I think you have something to add here about the work that Ashoka is doing.
Thank you, Leonora. Sure, yeah. There's a couple of strands here that we pursue, and one is, as this report shows, around the exchange of knowledge, and in particular, creating that knowledge in the sector and seeing where the common ground is. I think, as we see, there are often many definitions of system change or mindset change, of the complexity that's involved here. With that comes also a complexity of language. And so part of our main goal here is to help the ecosystem develop a shared language and shared understanding of what is needed to move forward. And that was one of the main purposes of the Embracing Complexity report, which you see a link for in the chat. But just wanted to point out, if there is interest to dive deeper, there is a report called 7 Steps for Funding System Change, which I authored prior to the Embracing Complexity report that goes a bit more into detail. And just as we did for Embracing Complexity, we're also looking specifically at the role of governments at the moment. We launched a report just last week called New Allies, where we help governments see opportunities for working with social entrepreneurs in education and beyond to accelerate system change and mindset change. And lastly, another way that we work in this field is by collaborating with other ecosystem players, among which, for instance, we've been working with the School of System Change at Forum for the Future to set up a whole, essentially an academy, a learning journey over several months for funders who are interested in this work. It's called Investors in Change. You'll see a link for that in the chat in a moment as well. And it comes highly recommended for any funders who'd like to explore this topic a bit more.
Thank you very much. So one thing that I'd be really interested to know from the perspective of most of you actually is whether or not you've noticed changes in attitudes to financing and what concretely this has meant for you and your work. Alicia, I know you designed a course on this. Can you tell us a little bit from your experience?
Sure, and just a a thought before going back to my prior experience, and this also draws from a comment that Ross made about the Jacobs Foundation. And so I don't know about a change in attitude in that sense, but certainly a welcome increased interest and urgency on the part of donors to finance organizations and innovations around the generation and use of evidence. And as I mentioned, Insights for Education is a new foundation, just about a year old, and we have a very dynamic and engaged co-investor collective. The Jacobs Foundation is not one of a part of our co-investor collective, but certainly close collaborators and co-conspirators. So in terms of the attitudes, it's been really interesting to see the level of urgency amongst funders to find solutions and interventions that support the increased use of evidence throughout the policy cycle. And so for Insights, we don't focus on the generation so much, but on the use and usefulness and utilization to inform policy decisions. As you mentioned, prior to my work with Insights for Education and Herald Advisors, I was with the Open Society Foundations for about 10 years. And through that experience, I led our education programs work on innovative financing or innovative financing for education. And a part of that out of that came a course that was developed for Central European University called Innovative Financing for Education, Arguments, Options, and Opportunities. And perhaps there was a heavy emphasis on the arguments. And one of the things I think that I've noticed that has shifted, again, perhaps not so much in terms of attitude, or it's led by the attitudes, is a significant shift in the global aid architecture for education to sort of crowd in and enable more non-traditional donors and non-sovereign donors to contribute to and engage in systems building and system strengthening interventions, as opposed to one-off interventions that are implemented in parallel to systemic interventions.
Yeah.
Arvashi, please. I think you have something that you'd like to add to that.
I just wanted to respond to you, Alicia, about the evidence gathering and how funders. It's a catch-22. Sometimes they want evidence, and sometimes they want to fund a particular kind of method of gathering that evidence. And when they say rigorous, sometimes qualitative research doesn't seem to them as rigorous as something that is numerical, that is quantitative. And when you have a very complex process, then it needs a complex evaluation system to capture that. Only that, and it needs long-term. It really needs long-term. So we've been fortunate, actually. It's very hard to find someone who is prepared to fund that. And also the other thing is that in countries like ours, even the evaluation system and the gathering of evidence has to be as frugal as your systems. It has to be cost effective. It can't run into millions of dollars because, it's a poor country and the population communities we work with are very poor. And if you're going to spend all that money on evaluation, it's difficult to put that money into the program that you're implementing. So what has happened recently is one of our funders, Echidna Giving, actually, they're based in California and they're wonderful. They said that they would fund a long-term evaluation, which is process. They would capture the process, and they're prepared for it to be a supportive evaluation that we will evaluate. And we told them, if it's a pilot, we're going to tweak it. This is working with boys and working with male teachers and trying to build, helping them to deconstruct patriarchal mindsets in boys, which is very, very hard. But we are trying to do that, and we've just begun. And so they said, so why don't we just put that in place right now? That it's very complex, it's very difficult, but let's start evaluating and documenting the process right from the beginning. And if you need to tweak, we will feed that into the evidence gathering as well. right? And willing to accept very broad parameters for this.
Exactly, and it's interesting. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead, Alicia.
I was going to say it's interesting that you mentioned Echidna Giving, because they're also a member of our co-investor collective. And just one thing I wanted to add to pick up from your point, Urvashi, about the over-reliance perhaps on RCTs. And part of Insights for Education's mission is also around the democratization of evidence. And so our emphasis is on ensuring that getting the best available evidence into the hands of decision makers to enable them to make decisions around their real-time challenges. And we recognize that the best available evidence is not just about the RCTs, but it's about, as Ross mentioned, the knowledge that is often trapped within classrooms about what works and for whom and when and how. And so we're also taking inspiration and insight from the health sector to pioneer an adaptation of the Cochrane approach for the education sector, which would enable syntheses of systematic reviews of an inclusive range of evidence that lead to or that create actionable recommendations and getting that into the hands of decision makers.
I think it's super, Alicia, and I do firmly believe that this idea of inclusive evidence generation and then inclusive evidence translation and use is going to be key. And I think also how evidence is used is going to be important. You know, I think there's traditionally been a
Sorry, Alicia, I think we'll come back to you. Ross, I know you had something to say in response to Urvashi. Would you like to go for it? And we'll come back to Alicia.
Sorry, can you hear me still?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, Ross.
I was just going to say, I think also there's been this kind of limitation as to how evidence has been used traditionally. And it seems to me that if we can build learning agendas around the inclusive generation and use of evidence, and if multiple organizations can share learning agendas, then I think this could be a really interesting way of weaving ourselves together at both the funders level and at the implementers level, and well, in fact, 360 degrees. So I'm very excited at the prospect of these new kind of progressive ways of building and using evidence.
Thank you very much. I'd like to come back to the, I understand that this is a topic of some debate, and I would love to go all the way down this channel, but I'd like to bring us back actually to the original question, which I would like to pose to Francois, about noticing any changes in financing. I know, Francois, that the CRI has been, you've mentioned earlier, the long-term relationship with the Bettencourt Schuller Foundation, and I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that and how their attitude to financing the CRI has started and perhaps changed over time.
Yeah, I think it did evolve. You know, I first got to know them because I got an award for the science I was doing, and then, you know, they discover I was using some of that money that I was free to use the way I wanted to help students, and then they wonder why I was investing in students. And I told them that, you know, even though they thought I would be investing in the research I was doing, and I told them that, you know, investing into the future generation would probably have a higher return on investment than investing in my own lab, even though, you know, I love the science I was doing, but I was lucky to have had, you know, other awards that at the European level. And so I didn't need money for my lab. So I did decide to invest on the students. And then they asked me if they could help me help the students. And then, you know, we did a first project, and then they said, you know, but, you know, you told us that the earlier the better. Can we help you to fund earlier students? And then, you know, they decided to double the amount that they were already given to us very generously. And then, you know, a few years later, they saw the amazing work that the students had done and the recognition that we progressively got from all sorts of institutions. And then they decided to keep giving us even more money. And in total, it's like, you know, adding a zero nearly to their initial funding. So that's you know, a big support. But the other thing I wanted to say is that in the meantime, what we noticed is that the French government started to feel that they also had to fund not just, you know, a specific project, but, you know, a project like ours that was not only doing one innovation, but it was sort of a hub to produce more innovations, and not just to fund one innovator, but to fund a place that would train the next generations of innovators. And then the City Hall started to join. And so I think, at least at the local ecosystem perspective, we clearly see a difference in the last 15 years. Progressively, ever more actors have started to invest in projects like ours that are systemic. And I think the local ecosystem is progressively evolving. What I have not seen as of now, and I'll be interested if people in the panel have ideas or discussing with others later, is how do we go from this sort of local middle ground, which is funding not the higher institutions, the upper ground, nor necessarily the lower ground, underground activists, but is sort of funding the intermediate level. And so at that local level, local middle grounds I've seen funded, and I know quite a few Fab Labs and other places where collectives come together and do creative things, but I haven't seen global middle grounds funded. And I think that the problems that we are facing today at the world level, like the COVID crisis and the climate crisis and all those sustainable developmental goal challenges that the UN has well defined, I think that the key question for me is, how can we fund global middle grounds? And so I haven't seen yet foundations or governments, they tend to fund projects that are local projects because, our governments are local governments, and because foundations, for tax reasons, tend to fund mostly projects where they can have tax reduction. And I think if we wanted to have the impact at the scale we need, it would be interesting to see system change funded at the global level. And I don't know, or maybe coalitions of foundations or coalitions of actors can start adding the impact at the necessary scale.
Thank you, Francois. I'd like to stay with you, actually, just on that point and ask you just very directly, what would you say to a funder now with the experience that you have raising finance for a giant education project or a giant social entrepreneurship project? What would you say to someone whose definition of impact is defined quite narrowly by a number of beneficiaries?
Well, I think that you can maybe change your mindset by wondering not necessarily how do I count only beneficiaries, but how do I fund people that will impact beneficiaries? So it's sort of a second order funding, if you want. It's not necessarily directly funding for impact, but you can fund people that will help people have impact. And so you still have to measure some impact at some point, but you have to have other metrics for this more indirect ability to fund an ecosystem, where if you make everyone that has an impact twice more efficient, maybe that's much better than funding only one project to double its impact. And that's a sort of question I would have. And then the second thing is, how do you measure impact is very hard, because the classical metrics are for the world of yesterday. But if you want to explore the world of tomorrow, then you have to invent new metrics on the go. And that's not so easy, but so you have to be able to do research on various things simultaneously. One is, how to create new metrics. How do you measure new forms of impact? How do you measure the impact of new ways of funding? How do you research new ways of funding? How do you take a distance from and understand that, the classical ways of funding have not been able to face the global challenges that we have, so that we need to be able to change scale one way or the other. And so, I think, one of the first questions the students asked me, but I think it's valid for funders as well, is, are you telling us that we have to take risk? And the answer would be yes, we have to take risk. Because if we don't take risk, on one side, we can get bored. But on the other side, we can not be able to solve the global challenges that we have. I think not to take risk is maybe the biggest risk we're taking. Funding the world as it is not going to take us out of the mess in which we are. We are in a current situation where we create problems faster than we solve them. So we have to invest into means to solve challenges much faster, to be able to mobilize collective intelligence at another scale. Probably no one would have founded Wikipedia, for instance. Yet they were an initiative that funded systemic change in terms of the way knowledge is produced and shared. And that's the sort of things that I would say. I think we have to try to invest into systemic change that happens at the right scale.
Thank you very much. I know it's something that Urashi mentioned earlier with her work with Chef. Florian, with your work with Ashoka and the changemakers, what would you say?
Yeah, I do want to pick up on that question around beneficiaries and how that holds up as a indicator for success. And I think something that's really key to distinguish here is contribution and attribution, right? Of course, we want to know at the end of the day that the experience for people in the system changes. So on a sort of macro level, we want to kind of measure how it changes. But what we cannot do is on that meso level, like where system change leaders like Cree, like Chef, are interacting with the system, it's very difficult to impossible to make a contribution, an attribution statement saying that because I participate in this collaboration, spoke at this conference, shared my knowledge here, I know exactly that these organizations have replicated my approach and that's why this many beneficiaries have been reached, right? That's a very difficult statement to make. So of course we all care about ultimately sort of the number of beneficiaries, but not just the number, also the depth of impact is important here. But that's why we distinguish between these three levels. So on the systems level, how is the experience changing? How are the results on the ground changing? Of course, it's important to measure. Similarly, it's really important to measure on the sort of micro level, as we talked about earlier. Alicia mentioned it, right? The importance of evidence, like, are the interventions working? Is the solution working? Is the innovation working? Is it delivering the impact that it's promising for a given group? Because that in itself can be a system change initiative, then going to decision makers and presenting that evidence and influencing around that evidence. But again, that middle level, that meso level, us working in these complex systems and trying to influence complex dynamics and stakeholder behavior, it's very difficult to make a clear attribution statement here to my work and how many beneficiaries were addressed. So that's just important to keep in mind when thinking about measuring success.
Thank you. And then Ross, from the perspective of the foundation, how have you addressed this potential problem?
I think we're in the process of addressing it. I don't think we've addressed it entirely. I mean, we certainly have lots of conversations and lots of ideas around how we might address this. That problem of attribution is a problem, of course, because anyone who's spending money needs to justify and report on how that money is being spent. Is it actually money well spent, in other words, which is a very important question to ask. I think in this also is the question of trying to look at how are we collectively spending our money. So I think we need to get beyond the idea of, my money, my project, my logo, my ego. And I think we need to really see as funders and providers and as whole systems at every level, at the macro, at the meso, and at the micro level, how are we working together to optimize our resources collaboratively? And that in itself requires new ways of measuring things. So we're in the process of looking at developing, just as an example of our thinking on this, so we're in the process of developing what we're calling a community evolution scale, which we're hoping will be a measure for a community, which would include, by the way, people working at the neighborhood level all the way up to people working at the national governmental level, to help them essentially not just measure their own progress, but also to reflect on their health, their diversity, the extent to which they're learning together. So to, again, place a focus not just on the outputs and the outcomes, but on the process of producing outputs and creating outcomes. So really trying to create tools that allow us collectively, in other words, to reflect on and learn from the processes that we're implementing. Because I think one thing that is often lacking in all of our work is that we often look at the system as a machine, as a thing which exists out there, and we often fail to see the system as a human living organism, and which is always evolving. And I think it's really important that we pay attention to our evolution as a system. And if we can find ways of measuring, monitoring, and learning from and about that process, then maybe we can have some impact.
Thank you. And Alicia, I know that a lot of your work has been on thinking about new ways of measuring impact. And as Ross says, everybody wants to know their money is being well spent. What have your reflections been over the years?
Well, one thing I think, and this is something that I think we should have certainly have learned in the education sector. First of all, if we're measuring impact and success by number of beneficiaries, then we are certainly, I think, unequivocally not embracing complexity. And I think that should be really held up as a problem. And that's a challenge and charge we need to put to our colleagues in the sector. But given the shift in emphasis in the sector from access to one of learning and quality, I think it's a shift that is taking place. But I think the more important issue and danger around focusing on number of beneficiaries is that it masks equity concerns, which are an increasing challenge, even drawing from Urvashi's examples of the work that she's doing in India and the gender-related concerns for access and learning. And Insights for Education will be releasing in the coming weeks a white paper that's calling on a knowledge bridge in the education sector. And this draws from 26 interviews with education leaders and system leaders. And one of the principles that they insist should be embedded in this knowledge bridge is prioritizing equity. And this specifically requires that we avoid averages and disaggregate results to help us understand, again, like Ross was saying, what works and for whom.
If I may, Leonora, I just wanted to add to this that, when I would say this to funders, where, impact is measured only by numbers of beneficiaries. Numbers are important, but they're not sufficient. And because it also tends to corrupt the process sometimes of the frontline people. I'll give you an example that we are working with a funding partner, and there are 20 schools, and there are 8 organizations that have been put together to work at these 20 schools at an enormous cost. And it's just not efficient. It doesn't work. So I was asking my team that, I said, why do they need 8 people when it's possible to do this with 2 or 3 groups, we can get together. They said, their funding is counted by the number of partners they can put together to execute a project. So their goal is to have many partners. They don't care. So that's what the team does. So when you measure it, when numbers are your only measure, well, and people do things with numbers, and I'm talking about that from NGOs, their perspective. I know NGOs that are doing that because they say, well, that's what the funders want. So if you aren't working hand in hand with them and you don't understand the real needs and don't take the time and the patience and the persistence and the effort to understand the complex work and look at and try to measure it, try to use complex measuring tools. It will need that. It will need that. And if you have a certain measure, then people comply. And when they comply, sometimes they comply only because that's your measure. That's a funder's measure.
This is something that I've had conversations with a lot of you about in preparing for this session, and it links into the conversations we've had earlier in the session about trust and about working hand in hand, as you just said, Urvashi. So, Francoise, I'd like to come to you about what some of the most difficult things you've encountered in financing complex systems and the areas that are overlooked. You have a phrase, I think, that you use with Gail.
Yeah, Gail proposed the word radical collaboration. And I think, our world is a world of competition and of domination. And so you tend to give the money and to the winner takes all, and that's the schools are competitive, the companies are competitive, and the granting systems are competitive, and so you encourage competition all the way. And I was lucky enough to be able to survive in that competitive environment, but I don't think it's the best environment to train the next generations of people that can cooperate and do together things that they cannot do alone, which is what we need to be able to do in order to face the global challenges. And so we have to find new ways of funding collaboration at scale. And at all levels, from the students that will collaborate together, to the organization that will be collaborating together, to the countries that should be collaborating together in order to create public goods and in order to create things that cannot be done by any individual alone or even any organization or any country alone. And so we have to find a radical collaboration that is in fact also a fractal collaboration, where, whether you are at the very micro level of a classroom or the macro level of the globe, you have to find ways to encourage massively collaboration. And that's something which, is just the opposite of what we've been doing so far. And I think as far as we are in this ego and logo conundrum that Ross was pointing at, we have to go out of this. And that's not easy, because we've been trained in a system where, it's the me first type of strategy that was winning. And so that's not easy. And I think that in a way, we have to go from this work on competition and exploitation to a work of collaboration and care, where, we are invited to care for oneself, care for others, care for the planet, rather than exploit oneself. Very often we exploit ourselves when we overwork and we are in this competitive strategy of schools and work. And then we exploit others, and then we exploit the nature and the whole planet. And so I think we have to change completely that mind shift. And it's not easy already for the individual to do that change. But how can funders change? Because funders are also competing with one another for reputations and for impact, and so on. And they are looking for the winner rather than looking to fund the ecosystem change that is needed. And that's tough. But I think that's where you ask me for a tough problem to try to solve. I think that if we could collectively start designing approaches to go for this, it would make a big difference. And to some extent, the other problem is, how do we identify people that we need to collaborate with? And so, my personal dream is to build a sort of a GPS of dreams that can enable us to identify co-dreamers and that are in the same dream space, and that we can come together to try to transform our dreams into reality. And so that's yet another meta question. But I think we do need to fund the ability to work together better and to have this radical collaboration. And that requires a change of the mindset and of the technologies to identify people that are complementary and that should be working together rather than competing with one another.
Thank you very much. I know that Ross has to leave in a minute, and I wanted to just get his thoughts on Urvashi's point about donor requirements and the areas that are overlooked. Ross.
Yeah, if I may just throw a couple of thoughts out there. So first of all, Francois, I fully agree we need radical collaboration. I would also say we need radical co-learning to accompany that radical collaboration. So I think working together and learning together to achieve the best results. There's a challenge in that. I mean, there are many challenges, but there is a particular challenge in that, of course, which is often competition has resulted in great innovations. So I don't think we should just throw out competition blankly, but we should look at how through collaboration and kind of collaborative competition, perhaps we can ensure that we get the best results. And I think in all of that, again, just to respond to Avishi's point, there is always this risk of colonialism. As soon as you have a funder and a recipient relationship, there is an imbalance in many ways. And I just think it's really important that as funders, we are aware of this and sensitive to this. And as recipients, we are aware of this and sensitive to this. Because unless we can get over those power imbalances, we'll continue to see colonialism, and we will fail to see this kind of radical collaboration and radical co-learning that we so desperately need. And sorry, I need to drop off, but it's been a pleasure to be here today.
Thank you very much for your time, Ross, and it's been a pleasure to hear from you and from the Jacobs Foundation, and we hope to speak to you again soon. Alicia, you had something to add to this point.
Yes, and actually, Ross mentioned it. I think one of the things we often overlook is the attention to power dynamics, and we've both Ross and Francois have brought up the issues related to egos and logos in the sector. In addition to that, though, I think one issue that we tend to overlook is not, or that tends to happen, is taking organizations or agencies or actors as monolithic organizations and not recognizing that they are made up of individuals that have our own idiosyncrasies, our own individual egos that operate and interact across the different levels that we work with. So one of the challenges that I faced, to go back to your question, in working at the country level, was the assumption that directives that are given at the central level or at the home office, sort of there's a consistent red line that trickles down to the implementation level or the country level, or what happens within a Ministry of Education, and not appreciating the time it takes to engage with different individuals in the same organization to help them sort of come along and foster the radical collaboration. And I think also sometimes, we often have these announcements about these innovative partnerships or radical collaborations and don't appreciate the amount of time and care and attention that it takes to operationalize that radical collaboration at every step of the process.
Yeah, and I think that's something that everybody has been saying again and again, is the need to really trust people and have these individual conversations. And that leads me into my next question, actually, about these kind of frustrations. It's quite a personal one. I'm going to ask Florian first, because he has many links with Ashoka changemakers and he sees this through their work firsthand on the ground. What is it, Florian? And obviously out of all of this has grown his desire to write this amazing report that sparked this session anyway. So what is it that you wish you didn't have to do? What conversations do you wish you didn't have to have? Or, to be a bit more positive in the spirit of the Learning Planet, what conversations do you wish you could have?
Yes, so I think one of the first ones that we touched on, I'll touch on both elements on the sort of negative and positive side. I think conversation I hope not to have anymore much. First of all, is the beneficiary conversation that we talked on earlier. I think it's kind of, we're going through an evolution. Not all that many years ago, we were still talking about overhead, right? And evaluating, organizations based on their overhead, which luckily we've let go of. And I think that the sort of beneficiary counting of beneficiaries is kind of that next evolution that we're luckily starting to let go of. But there's also a conversation that I still see happening quite often that I hope we can let go of at some point. It's this idea that really the ultimate success is financial independence and creating some sort of income model that allows you to have full financial sustainability. That can work in our experience. That can work well, but it's important to remember that the system change strategies that we've discussed here, right, like gathering evidence, investing time and capacity into collaboration, advocating for policy change, replicating solutions and supporting other stakeholders to replicate them. All of those are very, very difficult to make profitable. It's very difficult to build business models around system change strategies. So that brings us back to the importance of that unrestricted funding and essentially seeing yourself as a funder investing into leadership capacity, into systems change leadership capacity to do all of these things flexibly, to take a risk, to invest in new innovations, to test new initiatives in the system, see how the system responds and react as a result to that. So that piece around realizing that there is some limitations to making, a business revenue model around system change strategy is something I'd like to let go of. But I think on a positive note, I really do see the conversation change a lot. And I think something that complexity brings with it is humility. And that touches on the power dynamics that we've just mentioned. When I look at the founders that pick up on this and start really digging deeper into funding system change, I can't really put them into any category. It doesn't matter if it's a foundation, a corporate foundation, an investor, a government, or so. It's an attitude, it's a mindset that's open to complexity, that's open to learning, and joining into that kind of funding relationship with the humility to learn together. And ultimately, systems change when they learn. So I think going on that learning journey together is a great start to funding system change.
Thank you, Florian. And then from the perspective of another changemaker, Urvashi, what conversations do you wish you could have?
I tell you about a conversation that I did have. It didn't work, but I did have that. So this was a funder, and again, it's the 20 schools. And our part of the work was to do the pedagogical training to reform. These were government schools. So there were 20 schools, with about altogether 4,000 children. And I would really like you to take a guess at how many teachers there were in the 20 schools. Anyone wants to have a guess quickly? 16.
I was going to say 20. Okay. Wow.
So, yes. And they had chosen the schools and they had handed them over to us. And we are committed to working with the government. So I said, no, we'll definitely do that. So, but when I saw these 16, I said, hey, which teachers are we supposed to train? There aren't any teachers. And nothing is going to happen unless all your money is going down the drain if there are no teachers in the schools. So then I suggested to them, I went all the way to Delhi and I spoke to the head of the foundation. And I said, since you're putting in so much money into the government school system, there's a considerable amount. There's millions. I said, why don't you have this conversation with the government and get them to fully staff their schools? Not just these 20, but the whole district, if you can. It will really help because and I was trying to get them to fund a change in the education system in UP, which would have had a very long impact, not just for us, but for many others. Right? They didn't want to do it. So eventually we hired our own teachers, 33 of them. And this is not sustainable. This is just not sustainable. So here's the conversation that I wish I could have with funders. That when we are working with government schools, the system is broken in so many places. Governance is a huge issue. There are 2 million NGOs working on education and healthcare in India. And yet you've seen the visible learning outcome indicators. Yeah, report after report tells you. I'm too embarrassed to even tell you what those are. And at the same time, there are very few funders that are helping change the governance. That's the major system change that education system, large systems like ours need. And it's very hard to find funders who will say, all right, let's work with that. They could have done that, but they didn't. So this time with Catalyst 2030, we have 185 members out of our whole membership working on education, and they're all getting funded. And one of the things, I think you mentioned, Francois, that we should be rewarding funders who are flexible, who work as partners, who take the long term, who are willing to deal with complexity and have the patience to work with that. And so we've got these social entrepreneur awards, and we have a funder award, really, where we want to reward funders for this. We also have a whole working group that is trying to work at shifting the consciousness of funders. And, so it is, there's a whole working group trying to look at funders and funding and how it happens and to try and help. And I've nominated 2.
You've nominated 2. Are we allowed to know who they are?
Yeah, because they are exactly what Ross was saying. They work as partners. And they are not standing on top of you and, telling you what to do. They are willing to learn together. They're willing to listen. And they have a lot of faith. And they've been with us for 10 years now.
And when are the Funders Awards announced?
The nominations are up, and I think in March. I'm not sure, but I think it's March or April. You'll hear.
Well, we look forward to hearing that. So
that
leads me on to my final question, actually, which is really about the critical changes that we need to make together, and the Funders Awards, I think, speak very well to that, in order to have a sort of effective lead up to 2020 and the best outcome in 2020. So I'd love to ask each of you for your key takeaways from this session before we move to questions from the audience. I can see there are some coming through already. So critical changes that need to be made. What would be the best outcome in the lead up for 2020? What are your key takeaways, your absolute don't forgets from this session from our audience? I will start with you, please, Alicia.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to squeeze in a quick response actually to the previous question, which I think is also a takeaway. I think more conversations and engagement of local research, national research institutes and local local universities in national contexts, and ensuring that their research agendas and the evidence generation is closely tied to policy cycles and responsive to the needs and challenges in that particular context. It also it troubles me sometimes that we have many of the countries that we all work in have multiple schools of education that issue graduate degrees, yet the ministries of education rely on evidence and research that is done by agencies or universities outside of the context. Also, I think a takeaway is also for foundations and funders also to be perhaps urging towards the funder awards that Urvashi is talking about, and more open to funding systemic solutions and aligning their resources with national education sector plans, as opposed to funding pilots and independent solutions. And I think as a takeaway, I would encourage everyone to go to our website, which is easy to remember, education.org. We have a range of resources, national global public good, that will be released in the coming weeks. I think actually one significant report was released today, a synthesis and translation or synthesis of 1 year of school closing data. School closing and reopening data, where we've been tracking 101 countries for a full year. And so we've synthesized those findings into a report, and also the white paper that's calling for a knowledge bridge that I mentioned earlier. So education.org.
Thank you very much. Urvashi, could we come to you for your key takeaways from our session?
My key takeaway from this session is, one, I loved the idea, Alicia, and that having coalitions of funders as well is really an important thing. And the second one is, I'm very heartened by Jacobs Foundation, of the fact that they do, in fact, they are trying to fund complexity. There are foundations that do that. And my one message really to funders, or the ask to funders, would be that I wish funders would invest more of themselves in the projects that they found, to try and be fellow journeymen and women of the project, to show that they care and to show that it's not just the money. And where funders have done that, they have understood how difficult it is and how much it takes. It might not take more money, but it takes time. And so and it's not so easily countable. It's much more intangible than that. For example, if we were trying to put together caste curriculum, trying to change casteist mindsets, oh man, I don't know where I'm going to find a funder for that, because one, it's a very sensitive topic. It's like trying to deal with racism in the US. Right? And so how are you going to find people to do that? It takes a long time, because it's even harder than gender. So I wish funders would just invest themselves and agree to be co-journeymen with their.
Many thanks, Urvashi, and for all of your insights from the perspective of somebody actually working on the ground who sees this firsthand. Florian, from you, we'd love to hear.
Thank you. Yes, I want to build on Urvashi's last point and invite funders to join in these relationships with empathy and openness and an openness to sort of let go a bit of control and really co-create the work that is coming out of really a partnership in this case, right? To see yourself as a partner, as she's mentioned in this relationship. In a way, I like to draw this comparison where, for a long time now, for social innovators, social entrepreneurs, we've been talking about, user-designed or co-designed innovations, and it's second nature for social innovators to involve the community in co-creating their solutions, and most often coming themselves as social innovators with lived experience into this work. And in the same way, I think there's an opportunity for funders to see those that they fund as their own users, if you will, right? They need to use the money that you're giving them in a way that works for achieving systems change. And so it helps to really put yourself into the shoes of what are they able to do with that money, and how can I holistically support a social entrepreneur or a social innovator along this difficult path of system change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has come up again and again, this invitation for funders to join in relationships with empathy and openness, as you say, and create partnerships. And I know that's something that François has been doing for a long time. François, some final words from you.
Well, first, thank you for this nice session and these very open discussions and for the very important points that were raised by everyone on the panel. I think that this panel has been co-constructed, and what we're talking about is co-construction. The Wool Festival was co-constructed. The Wool Cree was co-constructed. I think the best program I know of have been co-constructed by the people involved, and I don't want to reveal a secret, but I believe founders are human beings too. And I believe that, they also have a heart, they also have personalities, they also have fears, they also have challenges that they are facing. And so the point I have, I think, is, we have to work together in order to co-construct the future. And the question is, what sort of framework can we use to be as open and as co-constructive as possible? And I think that, probably all of you know the Ikigai concept. And I think that this Ikigai is interesting because it can be a sort of, Japanese or 21st century version of the question of Socrates, of the know thyself, of the Socratic method, trying to understand, what it is that I know and what it is that I don't know, that, what it is that I love and what it is that I don't want to see, what it is that I need in terms of resources to thrive, and what are the resources I can provide to my community, and what are the challenges that the world needs to face, and what are the challenges that my community has to face, and what are the challenges that I have to face. I think if we are able to answer to those questions, whether you're a founders or a students, in fact, in both cases, you want to invest your time and energy and the resources that are at your disposition in order to make a difference and to have as much of a positive impact as you can. And I think, if we start having a common framework that we are all learners and we are all investing in our future, whether we're investing money or time or energy or knowledge, it doesn't matter. We are all investing together in this. And we have to invest in this common future and in our abilities to jointly solve those issues. And so I think if we had a common frame, we'll be able to do things together that we could not do alone. And I think that this ability to work together and co-define our Ikigai as individual, as collective, as institutions, and maybe as a planet, what is your reasons for being? what is our reason for being as human beings? What is the reason for being of our institutions, or for foundations, or for schools, or for universities, or for companies? I think unless we answer those questions creatively and collaboratively as human beings, and not just as people interested in profit or on fast return on investment, we won't be able to find solutions that are creative enough to escape the gap and the difficulties that we're facing at the moment. So I think that's what I would like to do, and I'm glad that I've heard very complimentary things in this panel, and I'll be very happy to discuss further with everyone on the panel and with everyone listening to this panel and willing to engage in such conversation, because I think that's the only way we can collectively do things. And just as closing remarks for the Learning Planet Festival, because that's, I guess, the last time I'm talking in this festival, I think that at first I want to thank the whole team, you, Eleonora, and the whole team that I won't be able to nominate everyone now, but they've done an amazing work upstream of the festival and during the festival to make this a success. And my dream is that next year would be even better. And even more constructed. And so everyone that is listening to this is very welcome to join and help us define what the next Learning Planet Festival would be. And the Learning Planet is not just about festival. It's about, doing things together that we cannot do alone. And the festival is just a way of celebrating what it is that we can do together that we cannot do alone. And so I'm really happy that this was as much of a success. And I'm even, I like to dream. So I like to dream that, next year we'll do even better. Between last year and this year, I think we are doing 100-fold better. So if we keep doing 100-fold better every year, we'll probably be able to, do something really exceptional progressively. So thank you so much to all those that have contributed to this festival. And thank you for all those that were on this panel. It was really a fantastic adventure. And I can't wait to see the next step of this adventure. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 5 minutes left together, and we are getting quite a few questions from the platforms. And I'd just like to ask one, if we've got time. It's something that I actually, as somebody who used to implement big projects in education, it really speaks to me. Somebody has asked how to simplify the process for funding system change at a local level. We've all talked about partnerships, and quite often we know that decisions about funding are made up here, and it's actually down here that the work is happening. And so there's a question about how local communities practically implement system change appropriated to their specific contexts. I think, Alicia, would you like to respond to that in the first instance?
Sure.
Sorry to dump you in it there. If anybody else would like to jump in on how to simplify it, please do. But...
No, it's fine. I think actually that question takes me back to 2 points that perhaps were already made. And I think it was Ross who brought up the point about creating the importance of creating a learning ecosystem. And also, if we think back to the conversation we had, I guess about, 30 minutes ago about the danger of equating, of measuring impact by number of beneficiaries. I think when we think about local communities or communities implementing interventions, particularly systemic interventions, that we recognize that it's not just a one-way process. That if we are actually implementing, or if we are able to create this learning ecosystem that Ross mentioned, that there's also a process of communities generating evidence and collecting evidence based on their experiences in the implementation process, and that figuring out a way through, and this will, when you see our white paper, when you go to our website, you'll see the solutions that we're building towards this, but also create a way for these experiences also to be synthesized together with or become a part of that inclusive range of evidence that is translated and synthesized for into actionable recommendations for decision makers. So for me, when I hear about communities and implementation, it's just recognizing, similar to what we were talking about in terms of teachers, we want to unlock the vast amount of experience and knowledge that exists in schools, in communities, that can help us to understand what works, how, when, why, and where. And that then will help us to better target, allocate scarce resources towards solutions and interventions that work.
Thank you, Alicia. And then Rashi, from your perspective, having worked for such a long time implementing systems change, please, how would you simplify it?
I was going to answer the question about, there was something about it, there are parallels between film and art projects.
We do. We have another question, in fact, from the audience. So if you'd like to address that one. Somebody has asked, are there any parallels from film and art projects funding that deal with difficult topics? The sustainability of funding source required maybe more in education, the education social context, rather than the arts funding project, the arts and film funding sphere, but there are evidently parallels. So please, if you'd like to speak to that.
Actually, I know from my experience that film and art and theatre on difficult topics, they're always crying because they don't get the funding. Right? And on the contrary, sometimes the topic will decide the funding, whether you get it or not. And there's censorship, there's withdrawals, all kinds of things that happen. So clearly that for very difficult topics, art films, quote unquote, they have to be low budget because no one is prepared to fund something. Most often people have had to go for crowdfunding to get difficult topics funded. So I think difficult topics have a hard time getting funded almost everywhere because, once again, funders are afraid to take the risks that it's needed. So.
Thank you, Urvashi. And François, as well, you have some comments on local versus global funding in response to the first question.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. And I think that at the moment, there is a big difference between research in health, which is my original subject, and research in education and innovation in health and biotech and education and innovations in learning, science and technologies. The health sector is very well structured. Research is completely international. There is clear standards. And, if there is a progress on vaccine somewhere, everybody's watching and saying, we want the same. And we are, at the speed of light, or at least as fast as we can, trying to face, for instance, this virus by international collaboration. It's not as perfect as we would want, but, it's happening very, very fast. If we compare this with what's happening in education, we don't have a place where, we would assemble the best innovations that are happening. We don't have a place where we can identify that, this fantastic project in India or this amazing school in Haiti are the sort of things that I would want to import in my country. And I think to some extent, we should be able to identify this, and that's part of the idea of the Learning Planet. And maybe the complement that we could think of is to say, oh, I've seen this school in Haiti, and I'm in Niger, or I'm interested in improving schools in Niger. And I would want to fund the ability to duplicate or at least try to adapt what's happening in Haiti that has been decided by the Logo Foundation, that is the most innovative schools in the world, and that is preparing so well children for the worlds of tomorrow. I want to know more about this. I want to document what's happening in Haiti. I want to have digital content that empower me to train the teachers in Niger, and I would like to be able to fund something like this. And we could imagine a mixture of crowdfunding and institutional funding, where developmental bank and so on could be identifying, thanks to the collective intelligence, scouting for the best practice in various fields around the world, what's happening here and there. And so I think in a way we need to have a sort of an agora where you can see everything and you can identify what's needed. And the difficulty is that today things are very diluted. It's hard to evaluate them, and we have a hard time identifying the things we need. And that's where I think artificial intelligence can be used, because an AI can read all the projects and can compute the distances between the needs and the project, and can try to do a first match, and then human intelligence can tell the AI that it should learn more, or that it's not that clever, and try to improve on it, so that the AI also learns, and that individually and collectively humans and machines will learn to identify the most appropriate solutions depending on the context, depending on the most relevant progresses that have been done elsewhere. So that for me would be one perspective that I would hope to see in the future. So as I see time is flying, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francois. So we've had we've spent an hour and a half and it's flown for me. We've had a lot about trust and co-creation of knowledge and the development of this ecosystem. We've understood, I think, that it'll take time. It needs engagement with individuals. And I hope that for our participants, you see this as an invitation to join us in constructing these relationships, in coming to us and to each other with the empathy and openness that has been mentioned, to create the kind of partnerships that are needed to finance this very complex system that we live in. I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us and for all of the time they've taken over the last few weeks to prepare the session and to share their thoughts. It's been really fantastic to have you, and I'm very pleased. We've got people who have just started their day and people who are about to go to bed and everything in between. So thank you for that. And also thank you to Ashoka, who co-constructed this session with us, and Florian in particular, whose report this session came out of. And also thank you to the participants who've come to listen on both our channels for coming to be with us today and for your contributions to the questions and the comments. This is the first in a series of planned discussions on this theme, and we hope that you will come along this journey with us and help us co-design and co-create them. Perhaps we can be the agora that Francois has talked about. But we'll be in touch with everybody who's expressed an interest as the year progresses to work towards the Learning Planet objective to solve the challenges of the SDGs. So please do stay in touch with us. The links are in the tab in the chat function. And for those of you who are leaving us now, I hope you have a lovely day, week, evening, month, depending on where you are at the moment. And I look forward to being in touch with you soon. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.